But there's another very important story we're following very far away. President Obama has been meeting with Arab allies who are deeply worried about the U.S.-led effort to reach some sort of nuclear deal with Iran. The Gulf states fear that their own security could be shortchanged by any such deal. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. He's up at Camp David, Maryland, where the president's getting ready to hold a news conference. What's the latest there, Jim?
Wolf, just before this news conference got started, the president made some brief remarks to reporters. During that time, he offered some very public assurances to these Gulf state leaders who are gathered here for this summit at Camp David. He said that the United States will come to their defense against what he called, quote, an external attack. There is no mystery as to who he was talking about. He was talking about Iran. It's not quite the picture the president wanted at this sort of summit with Gulf state leaders at Camp David. The Saudi king is not here, and the king of Bahrain opted instead to fly to Britain for the Royal Windsor Horse Show. The missing monarchs are raising doubts over how much the president can accomplish on a range of crucial issues, from Gulf state worries over the Iran nuclear talks to Tehran's meddling in the crisis in Yemen, to the battle against ISIS and the civil war in Syria. But the president insists this is a summit with substance.
The United States will stand by our GCC partners.
In the president's entourage, Defense Secretary Ash Carter, Secretary of State John Kerry, and Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, who's steeped in the details from the Iran nuclear talks. But the Gulf states want more than talk. They want to contain Iran's regional ambitions with a NATO-like defense pact with the U.S. and more weapons. The White House is proposing a common missile defense system for the Gulf and only security assurances, no NATO pact, plus more military sales.
The Gulf has some very unrealistic expectations about the United States curtailing Iranian influence in Syria, Iraq. So part of this is inflated expectations on their part.
The administration is downplaying fears the Gulf states will respond by launching into a nuclear arms race with Iran.
We've never had any indication from any of these countries that they are intending to pursue the type of domestic nuclear program that would raise concerns. We would say to these countries, we don't want to see any type of arms race in the region.
Instead, the White House wants the Gulf states on board with the Iran nuclear deal to help seal what would be a legacy-defining moment.
If he can bring this Iran agreement together in a way that can actually win the support in the Congress and win the support of the Gulf states, that would be a very substantial agreement. Right now, it's still uphill.
Now, within the last hour, the White House released a statement from both the U.S. and these Gulf state leaders. Very interesting to note, Wolf. In that statement, it talks about the Iran nuclear deal that is currently being worked on in Switzerland and will be worked on until that deadline of June 30th. We should point out, though, in that statement, it says that these Gulf state countries are supportive of the efforts to reach a deal that would constrain Iran's nuclear program, not the deal itself. And that is a fine point that I think the president may be asked about here in just a few moments, Wolf.
I suspect he will be. It's rare that the president has a news conference from Camp David in Maryland. How long have you been a White House reporter, Jim Acosta? How often have you had a news conference at Camp David?
This is the first one I'm aware of, Wolf, certainly while this president has been in office. And I think that is why you just heard the Saudi foreign minister who you had on your program earlier this week. He just came out and talked to reporters and said, he thinks that this was an historic summit, even though there were folks questioning whether or not the president really should be calling this a summit. He only had 2 of the 6 Gulf state leaders represented by actual monarchs. And so, but I think the agenda here was so critical to the security of this region that it really elevates this to at least something like a summit, because they were talking about issues like Iran's nuclear program, because they were talking about, and let's mention, the internal threats that exist inside each of these Gulf state countries, potential lone wolf, potential ISIS-style attackers who could wreak havoc in these countries. That is a big issue. That is something that the president wanted to talk about with these leaders. The president said earlier to the New York Times this year that poses as much of a threat to these countries as ISIS and Iran themselves. And so, I think it's interesting, Wolf, to see what the president will be talking about here in a few moments. He's got a lot to say to these Gulf state leaders. They're not walking away with any hard and fast security pacts that they would be comfortable with I think the talk here that we'll hear from the president in a few
All right.
moments will be very
Hold on.
interesting to listen to, Wolf.
Hold on, Jim. Here's the president.
Good evening. Before I get to what we discussed here today with our Gulf partners, I want to again express my deepest condolences to the families of those who died in Tuesday's terrible train derailment outside of Philadelphia. I want to express my gratitude for the first responders who raced to save lives, and for the many passengers who, despite their own injuries, made heroic efforts to get fellow passengers to safety. You know, for a lot of people on that train, it was a routine journey, a commute, a business trip. For the Amtrak employees who were badly hurt, it was their office, place of doing business, and that somehow makes it all the more tragic. Until we know for certain what caused this tragedy, I just want to reiterate what I have already said, that we are a growing country with a growing economy. We need to invest in the infrastructure that keeps us that way, and not just when something bad happens, like a bridge collapse or a train derailment, but all the time. That's what great nations do. So I offer my prayers for those who grieve, a speedy recovery for the many who were injured as they work to recover. And we will cooperate, obviously, at every level of government to make sure that we get answers in terms of precisely what happened. Now, to the work that brought us to Camp David. For the past 70 years, the United States has maintained a core national security interest in the security and the stability of the Middle East generally and the Gulf region specifically. This is a fundamental tenet of American foreign policy, upheld by generations of American service members and reaffirmed by every U.S. president, including me. Since I took office, we've intensified our security cooperation with our Gulf Cooperation Council partners, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and Bahrain. At a time of extraordinary challenges across the Middle East, including conflicts that have caused untold human suffering, the United States and our GCC partners cooperate extensively, countering terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and now ISIL, opposing the Assad regime's war against the Syrian people, supporting the legitimate government of Yemen, and opposing Iran's destabilizing actions across the Middle East. I invited our GCC partners here today to deepen our cooperation and to work together to resolve conflicts across the region. I want to thank each of the leaders and delegations who attended. And we approached our discussions in a spirit of mutual respect. We agree that the security relationship between the United States and our GCC partners will remain a cornerstone of regional stability, and our relationship is a two-way street. We all have responsibilities. And here at Camp David, we decided to expand our partnership in several important and concrete ways. First, I am reaffirming our ironclad commitment to the security of our Gulf partners. As we've declared in our joint statement, the United States is prepared to work jointly with GCC member states to deter and confront an external threat to any GCC state's territorial integrity that is inconsistent with the UN Charter. In the event of such aggression or the threat of such aggression, the United States stands ready to work with our GCC partners to urgently determine what actions may be appropriate, using the means at our collective disposal, including the potential use of military force for the defense of our GCC partners. And let me underscore, the United States keeps our commitments. Second, and to back up our words with deeds, we will increase our already extensive security cooperation. We'll expand our military exercises and assistance to meet the full range of threats, in particular terrorism. This means more training and cooperation between our special operations forces, sharing more information and stronger border security to prevent the flow of foreign fighters, and increased enforcement to prevent terrorist financing. We'll step up our efforts to counter violent extremism, including online, and more broadly, we'll expand our cooperation on maritime security and work to harden our partners' critical infrastructure. Third, we'll help our Gulf partners improve their own capacity to defend themselves. The United States will streamline and expedite the transfer of critical defense capabilities to our GCC partners. We will work together to develop an integrated GCC defense capability against ballistic missiles, including an early warning system, and we will work toward the development of rapid response capabilities to undertake missions such as counterterrorism and peacekeeping. Fourth, we pledged to work together to try to resolve armed conflicts in the region, and we've articulated core principles to guide our efforts. Respect for state sovereignty, recognition that these conflicts can only be resolved politically, and acknowledgement of the importance of inclusive governance and the need to respect minorities and protect human rights. Therefore, with respect to Syria, we committed to continuing to strengthen the moderate opposition, to oppose all violent extremist groups, and to intensify our efforts to achieve a negotiated political transition towards an inclusive government without Bashar al-Assad that serves all Syrians. We will continue to support the Iraqi government in its efforts against ISIL and in reforms to ensure that the rights and opportunities of all Iraqis are fully respected. We welcomed the humanitarian truce in Yemen, so urgently needed aid can reach civilians, and we call on all parties in Yemen to return to political talks facilitated by the United Nations. We will step up our collective efforts to help form a national unity government in Libya and counter the growing terrorist presence there. And we reiterate the urgent need for a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians. Fifth, we spent considerable time discussing Iran. I updated our Gulf partners on the negotiations toward a comprehensive deal to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And I'm pleased that here at Camp David we agree that a comprehensive, verifiable solution that fully addresses the regional and international concerns about Iran's nuclear program is in the security interests of the international community, including our GCC partners. Of course, whether we reach a nuclear deal or not with Iran, we're still going to face a range of threats across the region, including its destabilizing activities as well as the threat from terrorist groups. So we're going to work together to address these threats, and much of the enhanced security cooperation that I've outlined will allow us to do precisely that. But I want to be very clear. The purpose of security cooperation is not to perpetuate any long-term confrontation with Iran or even to marginalize Iran. None of our nations have an interest in an open-ended conflict with Iran. We welcome an Iran that plays a responsible role in the region, one that takes concrete, practical steps to build trust and resolve its differences with its neighbors by peaceful means and abides by international rules and norms. As I've said before, ending the tensions in the region and resolving its devastating conflicts will require a broader dialogue, one that includes Iran and its GCC neighbors. And so a key purpose of bolstering the capacity of our GCC partners is to ensure that our partners can deal with Iran politically, diplomatically, from a position of confidence and strength. And finally, while this summit was focused on security cooperation, events in the Middle East since the beginning of the Arab Spring are a reminder that true and lasting security includes governance that serves all citizens and respects universal human rights. So in the Middle East, as we do around the world, the United States will continue to speak out on behalf of inclusive governance, representative institutions, strong civil societies, and human rights, and we will work to expand the educational and economic opportunities that allow people, especially young people, to fulfill their potential. So again, I want to thank all of our GCC partners for making this summit a success. I believe that the Camp David commitments I've described today can mark the beginning of a new era of cooperation between our countries, a closer, stronger partnership that advances our mutual security for decades to come. So with that, I'm going to take some questions, and I will start with Julie Pace, because I promised her in the Oval Office that I'd call on her.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your statement the broad support for from the GCC for stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Did you get any specific commitments from the Gulf leaders for the framework that you reached a few months ago, and at least a commitment to not publicly oppose a deal if you're able to reach that? And on the Gulf's main concern, Iran's destabilizing activity in the region, how can you really assure them that Iran would not continue that activity if they had an influx of money from sanctions relief when they're already accused of doing so now with a weaker economy?
We didn't have a document that we presented to them to sign on the bottom line, will you approve of this nuclear framework deal, because the deal's not completed. And in the same way that I wouldn't ask the United States Senate to or